Hey, we're back with the Hardy Boys. The Secret of the Old Mill. We are on chapter 15. Lead to a counterfeiter. Crash! The green truck smashed through the heavy garage doors. The Hardys felt a terrific jolt and heard the wood splinter and rip as they shot forward in the farmyard. Wow! Joe gasped as he braked to a halt. We're free! But not saying what shape. Frank gave a wry laugh. Probably better than the front of this truck. The boys hopped to the ground and looked around the overgrown yard. No one was in sight. The whole area seemed just as deserted as it had been when they arrived. Let's check the house, Joe urged. Someone could be hiding in there. The brothers ran to the run-down dwelling. They found all the doors and windows locked. Again they peered through the dirty panes, but did not see anyone. I figured that whoever locked us in the garage would decide that getting away from here in a hurry was his safest bet. He must have gone on foot, Joe remarked. I didn't hear an engine start up. The Hardys decided to separate, each searching the highway for a mile in the opposite directions. We'll meet back at the service station we stopped at, Frank called, as the boys kicked their motors into life and took off towards the highway. 15 minutes later, they parked near the station. Neither boy had spotted any suspicious pedestrians. Did you see anybody come down this road in a hurry during the past 20 minutes? Joe asked the attendant. I didn't notice, fellas, came the answer. I've been busy working under a car. Find your friend. Oh, find your friend? No, that farmhouse was apparently deserted except for signs of a tramp living there, Joe told him. The Hardys quickly asked the attendant if he knew of any boarding houses nearby. After a moment's thought, he replied, I believe Mrs. Smith, who lives a little ways beyond the old place, takes boarders. We'll try there. Thanks again, Frank said as he and Joe went back to their motorcycles. Before Frank threw his weight back on the starter, he said, Well, let's hope Ken Blake can give us a lead. If we ever find him, Joe responded. They located Mrs. Smith's boarding house with no trouble. She was a pleasant middle-aged woman and quickly confirmed that Ken was staying there for the summer. She was an old friend of his parents. Mrs. Smith invited the Hardys to sit down in the living room. Ken's upstairs now, she said. I'll call him. When Ken came down, the Hardys noticed that he looked dejected. Frank felt certain that it was because of losing his job and asked him what had happened. I don't know, Ken replied. Mr. Markle just told me I wouldn't be needed any longer. I hope I'll be able to find another job this summer, he added. My folks sent me here for a vacation, but I was going to surprise them. His voice trailed off sadly. Ken, Frank said kindly, you may be able to help us in a very important way. Now that you're not working at the Electon Gatehouse, we hope you can answer some questions to help solve a mystery. Frank explained that he and Joe often worked on mysteries to assist their detective father. Ken's face brightened. I'll do my best, fellas, he assured them eagerly. Last week, Joe began, a shabby green panel truck went to Prito's supply yard and picked up old bricks and lumber. Our friend Tony Prito said there was a boy in the truck who helped the yardman with the loading. Were you the boy? Yes, Ken replied readily. Who was the driver? Frank asked him. Mr. Docker, the maintenance man at the mill. He said he'd hurt his arm and asked me to help load the stuff. Ken looked puzzled. Is that part of the mystery? We think it could be, Frank said. Now, Ken, we've learned since then that one of the bills you gave the yardman is a counterfeit 20. Ken's eyes widened in astonishment. A counterfeit? He echoed. Honest, I didn't know it was. Frank and Joe, Oh, we're sure you didn't, Joe assured him. Have you any idea who gave Docker the cash? Ken told the Hardys he did not know. Excuse me. Then Frank asked, what were the old bricks and lumber used for, Ken? Mr. Docker told me they were for repair work around the plant. After we got back to the mill, Mr. Marker and I stored the load in the basement. Is it still there? Asked Frank. I guess so, Ken answered. Up to the time I left, it hadn't been taken out. The Hardys determined to question Markle and Docker at the first opportunity. Then Frank changed the subject and asked about the day of the picnic, when Joe thought he had seen Ken at the window. I remember, the younger boy said. I did see you all outside. I never knew you were looking for me. When we told Mr. Docker, Frank went on, he said Joe must have been mistaken. Ken remarked slowly. He probably was worrying about the plant security policy. He and Mr. Markle always reminded me not to talk to anybody. During the time you were working at Electon Gatehouse, did you see any strange or suspicious person near either the plant or the mill's ground? Frank asked. No, said Ken in a surprise. Curiosity overcoming him, he burst out, so you mean there's some crooks running loose out there? Frank and Joe nodded vigorously. We're afraid so, Frank told him. But who or what he's up to is what we're trying to find out. When we do, we'll explain everything. Joe then asked Ken if he had seen anyone in the area of the mill with a bow and arrow. A bow and arrow? Ken repeated. No, I never did. I sure would have remembered that. Frank nodded and switched to another line of questioning. When you delivered envelopes, Ken, did you always take them to Mr. Victor Peters? Yes, Ken answered. The Hardys learned further that Ken's delivery trips always had been to Bayport, sometimes to the Parker Building, and sometimes to other office buildings in the business section. Did Mr. Peters meet you in the lobby every time? Frank queried. That's right. What was in the envelope? Was Joe's next question. Mr. Markle said they were bulletins and forms to be printed for Electon. Were the envelopes always marked confidential? Joe asked. Yes. Probably everything is that Electon sends out, Frank said. Sounds like a complicated delivery arrangement to me, Joe declared. Ken admitted that he had not thought much about it at the time, except that he had assumed Mr. Peters relied, rel- relayed the material to the printing company. Frank and Joe glanced at each other. Both remembered Frank's surmise that the bulky manila envelope had not contained bona fide Electon papers at all. What does Mr. Peters look like? Asked Joe, a note of intense excitement in his voice. Average height and stocky with a sharp nose. Sometimes he'd be wearing sunglasses. Stocky and a sharp nose, Frank repeated. Sunglasses? Meaningfully, he asked Joe. Whom does that description fit? Joe jumped to his feet. The man who gave Chet the counterfeit 20 at the railway station. The Hardys had no doubt now that the mysterious Victor Peters must be a passer for the counterfeit ring. And that is chapter 15. I'll tell you what, I would never be able to get a job reading books on tape or something. But I do my best. Join me later for chapter 16. Have a great night.